Meher, you're good to go.
Yes, we are live. Good afternoon. Hello, and welcome to Ananke's Women in Literature Festival 2024. We're delighted to have here with us an esteemed panel of fantastic writers where we're going to be examining whether language is the stuff of reality. I'd like to start off by saying the irony of speaking in English is not... Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to Ananke's Women in Literature Festival 2024. I'm delighted to welcome here an esteemed panel of fantastic writers where we're going to be examining is language the stuff of reality. Now, the irony of delivering this entire session in English is not lost on me, given that most of us think and have come from backgrounds where English is not a first language and it has been imposed upon us. I'd like to start off by introducing my panelists, starting off from Dr. Niaz Zaman, who calls herself an accidental feminist, is an academic, writer, and translator from Bangladesh. With a male name both before and after marriage, she passed off as a male writer in both academic and creative writing. Over the years, she's grown more aware of the continuing discrimination against women, and in her creative writing shown not only their struggles but their achievements. Zaman's forte is a short story, of which she has a number of collections. Her stories have been published in Kitab and Suspect. She also has 3 novels. She was part of the group which translated Qazi Nazrul Islam's novel. She also translated his novel Mrityu Shudka as Love and Death in Christian Nangar, and co-translated his Kubilika as a revolutionary. For her contribution to translation, she received the Bangla Academy Award for Translation in 2016. Welcome, Dr. Zaman. We also have here with us May Al-Nakib, who is the author of the novel An Unlasting Home and the short story collection The Hidden Light of Objects, winner of the Edinburgh International Book Festival's first book award in 2014. Her fiction has been published in Ninth Letter, The First Line, After the Pause, and the Merkers Review. Her essays have appeared in World Literature Today, Blab, and the BBC World Service, among others. She is the Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Kuwait University. Welcome, May. We also have here with us Sonia Bal. Sonia has spent 12 years in advertising, writing 30-second commercials from everything from candy to condoms, while dreaming of turning them into 2-hour movies. As Executive Creative Director at McCann Erickson, she decided to throw caution and her job to the winds to embrace full-time screenwriting. Her first gig landed her a finalist at Meisha Meera Nair's famed screenwriting lab. Sonia has co-written the screenplay for Noblemen, presently on Netflix, a dark adaptation of The Merchant of Venice set in a boys' boarding school, and the screenplay for the soon-to-be-released dysfunctional family drama Sitara. Sonia has also written 2 novels, The Spectacular Miss and A Year of Wednesdays. Sonia is presently developing a fantasy series for an Indian production house and has completed her 3rd novel. Born in India, Sonia spent most of her life living and working abroad, Jakarta, Miami, Brussels, London, Johannesburg, and Singapore. She is now living and where she writes and rewrites in Singapore. Thank you, Sonia, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have here with us Taran N. Khan. She's a journalist and a nonfiction writer. She's the author of Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul, which won the Stanford Dolman Travel Book of the Year Award and the Tata Literature Live First Book Award. Taran, delighted to have you here with us. Now, I'm clearly overwhelmed, but I'm going to start off very small. Ladies, language, we're all associated with it in some form or the other, whether it's writing novels, whether it's writing articles, whether it's translating, whether it's reporting, whether it's even speaking right now. And even if we look at it as a form of an identity, language is extremely important to all of us, not just on a professional basis, but on a personal basis. And it also sort of has a connection with our DNA as well. So I'd like to start off by asking, Dr. Zaman, perhaps we could start with you. What does language mean for you? Is it a form of communication? Is it a form of advocacy? Is it an identity? What does it mean for you?
Thank you, Meher, and I thank Ananke for inviting me here. let me just say one thing, yesterday we had a little informal discussion on Zoom, and I don't know who, we were talking about the irony of, English, that we all use English, and English has become an Indian language. Now, English has not become a Bangladeshi language as such, nor has it become a Pakistani language as such. But someone mentioned that, we travel so much. We go all over the place. I think someone, we travel all over the place. And so what do we call ourselves? We are not located in one particular spot. And perhaps for that reason, English has become our lingua franca. And I would like to mention to you that when you assume that here's a person from Bangladesh, this person must be Bengali.
That's right, yes.
So that is your first assumption.
That's right.
Now, I am not a Bengali. I am not a Bengali. I am one of those strange creatures which happen to be here, who happen to be here, because at one time, the subcontinent was united. So I was, when I fill up my visa form for India, they just cannot understand why I say that my father was a British Indian citizen, why my mother was a British Indian citizen, why I was a British Indian citizen at birth. The people in the visa office have no idea of it. Saying that, because I'm a Bangladeshi, I do have a particular relationship to language. All Bengalis have a particular relationship to language, and maybe I will speak about this. I did mention it yesterday, and I didn't want to speak about it, but I thought if I don't speak about it, then who is going to speak about it?
Sure.
India has been divided into these different states on the basis of their linguistic identity. Bangladesh came into being also because of its linguistic identity.
Absolutely.
When India was partitioned into Pakistan with its two wings and India in the middle, the question arose, what would be the national language of Pakistan? And as Meher said, that Meher is not an Urdu speaker, but Urdu was imposed on the people of what was then West Pakistan, just as Urdu was imposed on the people of East Pakistan. Now, there was a struggle, there were protests, and it was partly also a class thing, because upper class Bengalis, and I think this is what Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah couldn't understand. Of course, he didn't speak in Urdu when he declared that Urdu would be the state language of Pakistan twice. He spoke in English. Nehru, when he, gave his famous speech, he didn't speak in Hindi. Only, I think, Jai Hind were the two Hindi words. He spoke in flawless English. So, the struggle, and then the struggle, there was a struggle. India retained English. East Pakistan struggled against the dominance not of English, but of Urdu, because they saw that all the important posts were being held by Urdu speakers. And because Urdu-speaking families were the upper class. So it was a class thing. Now, the irony of it is, and I'll just jump several years, in 71, all the schools became Bangla medium, all the schools. Now, before 71, the schools offered English, they offered Bangla, they offered Urdu. They also offered a second language, which could be Sanskrit or Persian. After, in 72, all schools became Bangla medium. And what was the result? The irony was that a state which was built on language today has got 6 systems of education,
That's right.
with most families who can afford it trying to send their children to English medium schools, international schools, or what is now called English version schools. We have a national curriculum, but the children, they opt to write their exams in English. So what happened was, the struggle was for, democracy, equality, the exact opposite happened.
Yes, that's
And
right.
now what has happened, and I'll just move on to something else. So we have, we talk about decolonizing the mind, that very famous, idea which Ngugi threw out years and years ago, for which he has not won the Nobel Prize. And I don't think he'll ever win the Nobel Prize. We haven't decolonized our minds.
Right.
Even, people who can't afford English language education will hire tutors to send their children to English language schools, because they know that without English, their children do not have a chance to advance. So on one hand, we see the increasing importance of English. And on the other hand, we see something else. Some of you are aware that when Bangladesh was created, there was a large group of people who were not from Bengal, who came from Bihar, who came from from UP, and they were lumped as Biharis. Now, for a long time, Biharis, they were stateless. Only in 2008 did they get, the citizenship of Bangladesh. But they still live in camps. They speak in Urdu. Some of them have sort of moved out of the camps and they have adopted Bangla. But there is a remnant of their, Urdu language, which comes up occasionally, or the pronunciation, and which betrays them. But very recently, what has happened, for a long time, Biharis didn't admit, or, so-called Biharis, would not admit they were Biharis. But now, I've been teaching Biharis, do stand up and say, I am Bihari. And apart from that, Urdu, I don't have a mother language, because my mother spoke in a very, in Calcutta Urdu. My father was Punjabi. So our lingua franca was English or, Urdu. My husband was Bengali, and he was unfortunately or fortunately a die-hard nationalist. He forced me to speak Bangla. And the result was, for several years, I had a quarrel with Urdu. And then, I told myself that, I don't need to have a quarrel with Urdu. Urdu is not my enemy. So in 1998, I'll just take 1 minute. In 1998, I took up a project to write on novels of the partition in English, Bangla, and Urdu, and wrote it, and the book was published. But I want to talk about Urdu. Urdu-speaking people were afraid for a long, long time. But very recently, social media is very important. Very recently on social media, I see there's a group which claims its identity. And we were talking about identity. We were talking about resistance. This group proudly calls itself Dhakaiya, the Dhakaiya language group. Dhakaiya is a form of Urdu. It has got its own words, vocabulary, grammar. It's very different. And then there is also this resistance against good, correct Bangla. People from, for example, Noakhali have a dialect. People from Chittagong have a dialect. And they say, why should we speak in one particular Bangla? All Banglas are equal. So this question of language is a very emotive thing, and it is very complex.
It is. And
Thank you for giving me time there. I'll shut up there.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. And you've sort of opened up the
Oh,
conversation. May, I'd like
and,
to turn to you.
just,
And
yeah, just 1 minute. Let
yes,
me
yes.
just correct the pronunciation. I know it's very difficult.
No, no.
Mritu Khuda. It
Ritu
is
Huda.
the translation in Hindi, it would be Mritu, I do not know, Shuddha maybe, but
Huda,
it
right,
is Mritu Khuda, and it's a
right,
pun. It is hunger for death or deathly hunger. And the
right.
novel plays on both, on poverty and people who want to die for
Thank you.
whatever
Yeah,
reason.
thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
May, I'd like to turn to you, and I'd like to ask you about language in a Middle Eastern context, not specifically, but I'm just sort of saying because here in Dubai, where I'm based and where Sabine is based as well, again, the idea of different dialects coming forth and the idea of an Arab identity. And where does language fit in, particularly when we look at situations such as today, such as Gaza, where we've seen their whole identity being wiped out. And a lot of it has to do with their literature, with their documentation. And that's been so important. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think there are two questions here. So for me, so Arabic, in terms of identity, in terms of belonging, in terms of its literature, has an old and incredibly rich history. And for writers in this part of the world, Arabic remains it's just an incredibly important component of the literary landscape, but also the eidentic landscape. They're inseparable. I occupy as somebody writing in English, and for reasons that are accidental, historical, the accidents of what family you're born into, what the circumstances of, I'm sure that's probably similar for a lot of us on this panel. English became my mother tongue. English was also my mother's mother tongue because she grew up in India. English, she went to an English boarding school, English language boarding school. She spoke Hindi, and that has to do with the history of Kuwait. There were many merchant families that lived between Kuwait and India, so all of those things had to do with why English became my first language as well, which is, it puts me in it because of how important Arabic is to writers in this region, and just in terms of identity, it kind of has kept me on the outside, which is interesting. It's an interesting position to occupy as a writer, and it's one that I've come to appreciate in many ways. And I've never really felt an outsider to Arabic, and I've never really regretted English being my first language. And we can talk about those kinds of things. But to turn to the other very, very important question, I think, about language, culture, and identity, and its erasure in moments of war, in moments of genocide, like we've been witnessing over the last 7.5 months in Gaza, it is absolutely a key element of this process of ethnic cleansing. So language and culture and literature and the work that journalists do is seen as indispensable to the buttressing of resistance and giving a real well, we're seeing the effects of this, right? So if writing wasn't perceived as a material threat, really, we wouldn't have all of the journalists that had been killed over the last 7.5 months, killed, writers, universities destroyed, archives destroyed, right? All of that is seen as being of incredible value. And this has been the case, since the period of colonization and decolonization. The aspect of cultural combat has been as important as armed resistance, and obviously colonizing forces recognize this and want to, taking away language and the identity that language allows for, but also the cultural elements, all of that, that has been part and parcel of the process of colonialism. And it's nothing new today. But on the other hand, we're also seeing the incredible power that Palestinian voices, Palestinian writing are having, whether it's because of the journalists that are doing their work despite the odds, various academics, writers, social media activists, just regular people all over, whether in diaspora or in Gaza, in the West Bank, or global allies. We're seeing the power that words have because they are effectuating change. We're actually seeing the transformation. It's slow. It's certainly not as fast as we would want, but it's faster than it has been in the past. So we're seeing the social media and various technologies are enabling a kind of material transformation in people by way of language, by way of words, that I think is unprecedented. So that can give us space for a little bit of hope, I think.
No, absolutely. And I think you've said so many important things. In fact, Sonia, I'd like to ask you about the use of language in cultural representation. But while you think about that, Taran, just carrying on from what May has said in terms of the role of journalists. Now, you and I both are journalists. We've both written nonfiction books. And I think that one of the most, when I get asked, why do you do this? My story is always the same. It's like, these are stories that need to be told. And my own personal struggle is when I'm telling stories from the indigenous perspective, because that's where I feel so compromised, that why am I telling their stories in a language that's not theirs, but I am clearly a product of the British colonial Raj, if you must, that's where my conundrum lies. How do you feel about what May said? I mean, the cultural representation and the work that journalists are doing. And I mean, what's your thoughts on this?
I think these are all really excellent questions to think about, and they always do come up when we're working as journalists, as not only reporting the news but writing about nonfiction, really, as people. And I think the way I can be useful to this incredible panel can be to come at it from the angle of a nonfiction writer, which is very much
Yeah.
engaging with the material world, the stories of people, which can be very often more. I always find them to be far less believable than fiction, really. It's just, real life is really something. And just taking up from what May said, I think what's happening in Gaza and what you said about how do you get into a space where there is vulnerability, but there is also a need to tell stories. But also, it's clear that none of these people are voiceless, in the sense that, when I was a journalism student, there was this sentiment that came up quite often, is that you have to be a voice for the voiceless. You have to tell the stories of people who can't tell their own stories, which is obviously, I think, for me, quite it's not a notion that holds up in any way
Yeah.
anymore, because of course everyone can tell their own stories. And I think when I was writing my book on Kabul, for me, it was not a difficult situation because I put myself in the picture. I think when it makes me uncomfortable as a reader is when you see the writer as either as an invisible creation, in the
Yeah.
sort of voice of God mode, where you're not quite sure who this person is, but they know the best. And I think a lot of writing on Kabul, and I'm just going to speak about Kabul because that's, I think, also so much resonance between um, what's happening in Palestine and what's been happening in Kabul in a larger sense, in terms of erasure, in terms of memory formation, in terms of whose stories are heard and whose stories are, sort of obscured. It's
Yeah.
very resonant in a way. And for me, so just to address your point first, is that how I dealt with it was by putting myself on the page. And my book is very clearly the product of a woman from India going to Kabul and encountering stories there, which I tell, and then I also connect them with my own stories, which is my
Yeah.
grandfather. And an interesting point about language was that a lot of the book, when I went to Kabul in 2006 for the first time, most of my reading was English sources, and most of my reading
Yeah.
was very much,
Yeah.
the sort of colonial informed writing, I would say. And then also, of course, more journalistic contemporary accounts. And my grandfather, who was fluent in Persian and Urdu and English, and he was a person who spent his whole life in literature and writing. He then would tell me stories that he would draw from the Persian canon, which is sort of the connection between Afghanistan and, well, that
That's
was
right.
once
Yeah.
one swath of land, but now Pakistan, India. He would connect these beautifully, and he had never been to Kabul, but he would tell me stories about it because he had read these stories about the Shahnama, which belongs to, I suppose,
Yes.
every person who speaks Persian, and that would just change the city for me. So the shift in language, and this is something I've written about in the book, the city completely shifted, and it became so much richer, and then I could engage with it in a completely different way. So I think there is, my argument, I suppose, would be for everything, would be for widening, instead of sort of interrogating, well, is this us, is this not? I would like to say, well, why can't everything be this, and why can't we be of all of these languages? So that's how I dealt with the question. And
Yeah.
in a larger sense, I think what I found really interesting in Kabul was how you could, how forgetting is never a casual act. What you
No.
don't hear is as important as what you do
Yeah.
hear. And I found a lot of what really spoke to me in the city was in that liminal space between forgetting and between remembering, and recognizing that the forces that are responsible to this. In the very first part of my book, I call Kabul, and this is a phrase I read in a historic account of it, the beautiful history of Kabul, which describes it as an amnesiac city. And I thought that really summed it up, because an amnesiac city, in this historian's description, it was not a city where there is no past, but it's a past that has been obscured. And I
Yeah.
think in Kabul, 4 decades of war have obscured this incredibly rich, incredibly cosmopolitan past to only be about conflict. And so you see people only either as victims or as noble survivors of conflict. And that is incredibly, I think, a reductive way to see it. And language has a huge part to play in this. Now, the moment you're able to imbue language in not just the person telling the story, but in all the people who are talking and all the memories that come out. And I was able to also explore the city in the company of people who knew the city not only in their own lives, but through books, through fables. If you draw on this like diversity of sources, I think it's a very different experience then of reportage, and also then of what nonfiction can then tell the story of. Yeah, I mean, that's my longish answer to your question.
No, I completely agree. And one of the things that I absolutely love what you've mentioned is that, language does not necessarily have to be the spoken words or the written word. And in fact, May, you might be able to comment on this. Sonia, I'll just turn to you to know your thoughts about this as well. One of the things that I discovered when I came across the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and in particular, those religious minorities that are persecuted in Pakistan, was that they told their stories through embroidery, through craft, because they'd never gone to school, they never had an education, and today, even now, they sign their documents using their thumbprint, right? But the way that they told their stories and the way that they passed on their culture, their traditions, their beliefs was through embroidery. So, Sonia, going back to what you had said yesterday, and of course with the whole cultural representation in pop culture through language as a social construct. You had identified this so well yesterday, and I really thought long and hard about it. Even like the clothing that we wear, or the food that we eat, all of it is a form of language. So is it a social construct? Is it an owned identity? How do you feel about it?
So my experience is going to be a little different from perhaps all of yours, because I don't have a journalistic background. I don't write nonfiction. I'm in the more popular space. I write screenplays, and I write fiction books, and what I find is that for me, I think language is a moving, evolving thing. For example, I mean, you can take somebody like a Jhumpa who wins a Pulitzer in English and then pivots and says that the way she says English was thrust upon her. She grew up with a mother language called Bengali, which she could not express herself creatively in. She could only communicate in that. But she's a professor and she's fantastic in English, but she felt the kind of conduit she had to feelings and saying certain things through Italian made her feel richer and more liberated. So that I think for me, that's an example. And then to the other side, I'm going to go with something extremely popular. I mean, if you just look at the cultural juggernaut that is South Korea, they are language agnostic. There was a time that we only knew them for cars and gadgets. Today, there's K-beauty, K-pop, K-literature, K-everything. And the thing is, the world has become agnostic to language through them. The consumption of their whatever they're putting out is so high, and they are not changing it to English. Or I think they are changing perception. there was, who thought a time would come when globally we would think the androgynous, vulnerable boy look would beat a Brad Pitt. But
Yeah.
that is what is happening through their perception of what they are putting out to the world. So and they're not doing their stuff in English. Netflix has this thing of the highest grossing shows are from Spain, Money Heist, and from Korea, Squid Games, and not in English. They've beaten Bridgerton, which is an English thing. So I know this is very light when it comes to
No, not
talking
at
about
all.
what
No,
language
no.
does.
It has a global
But
impact, and that's what we're examining. Like, how does and the trickle down effect? I mean, you have children,
yes, it's
running
exactly that.
around.
I mean, if you look at the fact that the Oxford Dictionary has declared a word called Riz as the word of the year last year, which comes from Gen Z using that word to describe charisma and sex appeal, and I think language is morphing. So we no longer, yes, we're, at least all of us are schooled in the typical British English language, and personally I think and write in that, but mine tends to evolve because I have to be so much in touch with the popular lingua franca. So I think even that evolves after a while. And I think that's why I consider it, I mean, a lot of what I write in my screenplays get translated. So for me, I think the superheroes are actually today's translators. It's, if we can get in every form people who are devoted to the text and to make it their own and send it out in a world that it's understood, I think that to me is a huge thing. Yeah, so that's a little bit of how I see language. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. Dr. Zaman, I want to pick up on something that you had actually said about how people were talking about this different dialects of Bangla, and there's not one specific one, and they outrightly reject speaking another language. And do you feel that there's a sense of ownership, or there's a recognition that the imposition of a language has actually exploited, existing fissures in society based along the lines of ethnicity, religion, sect, cuisine, whatever it may be? And so there's an active rejection of that now?
Yeah, thank you. This, it comes up a lot in fiction writing.
Right.
When a Bengali, and this is, you talked about translation, and this was a problem that I do a lot of translation, and I edit books, and I have a number of translators who translate. And, we came upon this problem that how do you translate dialect? And the young woman, she's become very famous now as a translator. Her name is Shabnam Nadia. She lives in the States now. And, she was translating her mother was a writer, but she doesn't write very much. She was translating her mother's story, which was told in dialect. Now, outside Dhaka, even Dhaka, of course, as I said, that you have Old Dhaka, which has its own language. Now, it is very difficult to translate a dialect into another language. And, this young woman, Shabnam, she was much, much younger then. She tried to do it by creating a different type of English. But then what happened was, there was some famous translator, some European who came to Dhaka. And, he was speaking, and he was given this book, of which, I was very proud, and Shabnam was very proud of her translation. And, he had read, the only story he read in that book was the story translated by Shabnam. And then he said that this is ridiculous. You cannot translate dialect. And of course, he did not give an answer, because if how do you show that this is not, proper Bangla? How do you convey to the reader that it is dialect? Now, when I wrote a story, and what I did was I used a lot of, there was this character, a kebab wala used to sell kebabs. And what I did was I put a lot of the way he spoke into the narrative. So his dialogue, his speech was in Dhakaiya. But then I gave it the translation into English. And then, of course, someone said, you can do it a few times, but why do you do it all the time? And I said, well, you see, I want to give the flavor of this language because it is very different from the normal Bangla or the normal Urdu. Now, what is happening in Bangladesh is, there is not really, I would say, a king's Bangla. But there is a Bangla which is supposed to come from West Bengal. It is called Nodia Bangla. And that is supposed to be the finest Bangla. So it's from West Bengal, but it's not the Calcutta Bangla, because the Calcutta pronunciation is very different from the what we say, the proper pronunciation of Bangla, which we pride ourselves on in Bangladesh. But there are people, when they go to the offices, to the workplace, they will have, if they speak in English, they speak in English. If they speak in Bangla, they will speak in what is called Shuddho Bangla, proper Bangla. It is only among their friends that they will speak in this dialect. When they write stories, that is when the dialect comes in. When they write plays, that is when the dialect comes in. And so there is this, and then we have, of course, a number of indigenous groups, several indigenous groups, which have their own language. Many of them are not written languages. And then the government wanted, these children to be taught in their language. Of course, they're being taught in their language in the early stages. But the problem there is that these children will have to go to get jobs, compete with people who speak Bangla or who speak English. So what do? So many, who can afford it, if you are poor and you have to go to the local school, you go to the local school and you struggle with, your tribal language, which your teacher also doesn't know because, she or he has just been taught. But if you can afford it, then you send your children to the nearest big town where, the whole, the parents migrate, or the grandmother goes, so where they can go to a proper school where they can be taught the language which they will need, when they are of a working age group. So I don't know whether I've answered your question about dialect.
No, you haven't. You have, and again,
it is a struggle.
It is, and I'm going to turn to you, May, because Dr. Zaman has highlighted a very important thing: the role of language when it comes to schooling and education. And again, I'd love to know your thoughts about this in the context of Haza, but of course, you're free to put it in any other context you like. The destruction of universities and the destruction of education institutes. You see the basics of language, the formation, whether it's the scripture itself. When that erasure happens, how do you think, can a language survive? Can these stories ever be told again? Can the documentation process ever be picked up again?
I do think they can be. I don't think, and I think this is the sort of the great irony and frustration that that is carried on the backs of the colonizers, is the inability to fundamentally end a people. It's not that easy. As awful as things are, as awful as what we're witnessing, and of course genocides go back, right? This is not the first genocide. I hope it will be the last, but people survive and they carry the traces of their history with them across generations. And part of that is through language. Part of that is through family stories, as Taran said, things that you remember, the things that get forgotten, but other things will be remembered and put forward. So while what we can't underestimate or what the incredible destruction that's happening in Gaza and ongoing. But I don't think that I'm in a position, or any of us are in a position, to say, well, then this destruction is going to be total and that nothing will be remembered, or that there's going to be a kind of complete decimation of language and memory and the existence of Palestinians. I also think it's important to think about the role that the imagination plays. I mean, like Sonia, yes, I'm an academic and have been, but I also write fiction. And for me, the space of fiction, the space of the imagination is such an incredibly powerful element that I think we sort of take for granted how important that is. The ability to imagine, whether through fiction, whether it is through popular culture, whatever it is, the future or alternatives to the present. That is something, I think, the special capacity of fiction to do that, I think, is what gives us, again, a sense of ethical purpose as we write. But also, I think that is again, not just for writers, but for anybody, right? Even readers, the space of the imagination is something that allows us to persist as human beings, I think. And I really believe that that's one of the important components of, or the elements of resistance, I think, are it's taking away the capacity to imagine is really the end of things. And hopefully that will not be the thing that anybody can do. Yeah. I don't know if that really answers your question.
No, it really does. It really does. Sonia, what are your thoughts on that? And Taran, I'd love to ask you about what I've just asked May about the erasure of language in Afghan context. Sonia, what are your thoughts on what May's just said?
What May just said truly, truly resonates with me. And I think in a way that's been my resting pulse in terms of imagination. The famous saying that logic can get you from A to B, but imagination can take you everywhere. And I think at least maybe it's a function of the kind of work I do, whatever, but I feel that I think the greatest freedoms of all is imagination, and I think the ability to do that in some ways preserves things that are being destroyed or things that haven't happened yet, and to me, I think that perhaps has to be encouraged even more than a certain set a set of rules that says you should be learning these languages or you should be. I think it is about encouraging a certain freedom to think and to create that will, I think I personally feel that will overcome whatever we are losing because of morphing language or repressed language or not keeping up with language. I think it is, the answer does lie in imagination as far as I think.
No, absolutely. Taran, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, the power of imagination is clearly something that's very powerful, but then we've also seen the erasure of the written word or any sort of freedom of thought in the context of Afghanistan. But I mean, that's not just limited to Afghanistan or the global south. We also see that happening in the rest of the world, what is deemed as the civilized world or the West, where we're not even able to tell our own stories. And that also, I believe, is a sort of this form of strong censorship bordering on erasure of the lived experience. What do you think about this?
I think what May said is really resonant, where she mentioned alternatives to the present. And I think that's something that is truly, maybe if you really drill down to the core of why, or at least let me just speak for myself, why I write is to seek the commonality and experience. I mean, there's a reason why a novel from the 15th century will move me as much as, say, a translation of Arabic literature. And to Dr. Niaz's point of translation, one of my favorite books on Kabul is a translation of Sayyid Mujtaba Ali's Bangla travelogue called Desi Bidesi, which is in English, it's been translated, and I've read it in English as I think it's translated as a land far from home. And the title is slightly ironic because he describes it with the love that is owed to home. And that's, I think, why it struck me as being the book that most closely correlated to my experience of being in Kabul, because he seemed to notice exactly the same kind of things I did. You know, this man who was in the city in the 1920s. And there was a sense of just complete connection to his gaze. I felt that it was harder for me to place in other accounts. What was that? I think, but the sense of, you know, imagination, of being able to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person, which is what I think destruction aimed at writing seeks to decimate, is the ability to imagine the other person as yourself. And I think in Kabul, again, this is something I wrote about in the book and also in August 21, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. There was this kind of discourse in popular media, in the news, as if this was a foregone conclusion, and also as if violence and this kind of, you know, what was called tribal infighting or tribal warfare was almost a biological precondition or something embedded in the soil. And this is something that someone had actually asked me, like, is it something embedded in the soil? You know, questions like this I think come up when there has been a history of erasure, of reduction, of the
Yes.
slow chipping away at the sense of humanity. It's not an accident. It is absolutely by design that you're able to think of a city, of a space, of people in these terms. Because if they're not like you, then the violence that happens to people in these spaces isn't something you can imagine being inflicted on someone like you. And that's important, because then you can distance yourself from this kind of violence. You can locate yourself, your body, people you love from outside of that kind of violence. And then it is, in a way, you're protected. So I think this is the core of why we write. This is the core of why there are attacks on writing. And this is what
Yeah.
all of this is what language carries. And for me, I think more and more, it might sound anachronistic, but I'm coming to the idea that poetry is the truest form of nonfiction, because it
Yeah.
speaks in image and it is incredibly concise. It's like a snapshot. It is very, very clear, but it is also laden with a lot of meaning that the readers invest for themselves. So
Yeah.
you know, and I think, just to end my sort of where I am in my mind with current affairs, with my own writing practice, is that I feel there is a need to articulate the fact that we are at a critical moment, where there is a turning away from center and margin relationships, where language, I do think we can be various, and we should find power in the sense of being various, and not invest authority only in the places where traditionally it was meant to be seen, but to see these spaces, like this incredible panel where we're all speaking from what are so-called margins, but speaking with, I think, incredible grace and history and dedication. So I think that if we keep saying this, alternatives do emerge, and that is, I think, the only antidote to the dynamics of erasure that are playing out.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Tarun. That was absolutely fantastic. Sonia and May, I'd like to sort of ask both of you this question, and whoever would like to go first, by all means. Tarun's highlighted a very, very important aspect here, the role of writers, and how, you know, you have the politics of erasure and representation here. Now, Sonia, you know, like you said, you're more sort of associated with the pop culture side of it, and how it's represented on our screens. But May, we've also seen over the years how academia, the ultimate form of writing, right? That's how you're sort of seen as your career trajectory as a writer, how that's sort of been undermined by its own sort of stance on politics. Like, where do you think people's perceptions are going to be shaped more and more by how language is used to represent stories, and especially those from marginalized communities? Um, or do you think academia will still very much remain the gold standard, that unless it's been put, you know, written in a form of a book, or it's taught at a university or at school, it's just a fleeting thing? So whoever would like to go first.
No, I don't
May?
think that, I mean, academia has undergone massive transformations, sometimes from the bottom up, sometimes from top down, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. I mean, everything is very, very much in flux, I think, as it should be. But I also think with the changing technologies, with the incredible impact of social media, things like TikTok, Reels, people's entertainment and the kind of the ways in which they consume culture is extremely diversified. And I don't think, you know, people are sitting around reading if they ever were, but, articles written in academic journals, which are often read by a very limited circle of people. So I think that what we do have, I think in all of these different forms, language is materially effective. It changes people, whether they're watching a film on Netflix, whether they're, again, absorbing things on social media, whether they're reading an academic article, whether they're reading something that's written by journalists, but mainstream journalists versus alternative journalists, blog writers, whatever it is. All of these forms of writing can have impact. And I think that they do, right? I mean, because it is through writing, through language, that ideologies shape us and make us who we are. Again, and those vary. So they transform. So I think that things are, I think it was also Tehran that you ended on this note, right? Saying that it's the variousness that is going to offer up these alternatives and these different ways of narrating our stories and the many stories that proliferate and in unprecedented ways we have access to, which I think is new and I think encouraging also.
Sonia, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because I believe, that age-old thing of the medium is the message sometimes. And a lot of very serious stuff is said on places like say Twitter, now X, which is kind of imploding but forget what's happening now. But some very serious opinions are shared there, political or otherwise, including there's been such a beautiful gush of Palestinian poetry, where there's this people who are just putting up every day one poem there, and which kind of in a strange way is keeping you in touch with what's going on. You could have been a little indifferent to it, but for those who are not reading long form, that is a constant reminder of what's going on. And I just feel that somewhere along the way, whatever the medium might be, whether it's TikTok or a journal, or I think the idea is that probably we have to all have these, inhabit these multiple linguistic personalities, where you write for the medium and you communicate your ideas through that. And you find ways, whether it is something serious or something which you just want to promote, you find ways, you find the medium and you get the message across, And I mean, recently there have been a whole spate of very serious films, for example, whether it's talking about the Indian experience with the Scorsese film of The Flower Moon. Now, those are people who would never pick up a history book and read, but they've sat through a 4-hour film and understood what went on in some manner, and I think that's very much about using the medium and passing on the message, whatever the message might be, however serious or not serious it is. But I think it is about morphing and adapting to the medium now.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sonia. We're nearing the end of our session now. So if anybody would like to share their, last thoughts on this topic, I'd be grateful. We'll start off with you, Dr. Zaman.
I agree with Sonia and Taran that and May also, because academic writing, I'm sort of retired. I retired last year, but I find that a lot of academic writing is written because you have to have a number of papers written a year, and a lot of these papers are really not worth the time spent reading. No one reads these journal articles, and I'm sorry to say. Very few of these are of any value. They are done for the sake of promotion, because the university insists that you have to have a certain number of articles published in recognized journals to get promotion. So there are all sorts of ways. And you're so right that people who reads those journals, Nowadays, a lot of print journals no longer exist. People are not, universities have decided that they will not print journals. They do not have space in the libraries for print journals. So journals have gone out of fashion. And what people are responding to is actually social media. And a lot of the important messages that we get is on social media. Social media has become a very important tool. And like people ask me, you do Facebook? I said, yes, I do Facebook because I find, like there's a protest. And of course, there is a law. There is someone, Big Brother is watching. If you say something on Facebook, you might be arrested. You might be one of the disappeared. So there is that danger there as well. But there are some brave people who say things on Facebook for others to know. I don't want to say much about it, but there is a law. And, I think the government, if the government wants, our emails to see, what emails we have sent, I think the provider, the internet provider has to give the government this. So there is, a danger there as well. We are not as free as we think we are to speak our minds.
That's
end with
very,
that.
very true. And I think that's something we can all relate to, that we really are not as free. And there's still massive issues surrounding censorship and erasure. And I think that's where the battle for linguistic freedom and storytelling certainly lies. May, would you like to offer any thoughts?
I just, again, when we're thinking about the title of our talk today, or of our panel today, I think that language is really as real as we are. And we are as real as the language that shapes us. It's very hard to imagine ourselves outside of language. We're made of flesh and blood, and yet that flesh and blood only comes to make sense through language. But I think what gives hope is that as much as language shapes us, we end up shaping it. And that in the process, through the connection that occurs between writers and readers, we end up shaping the world. It's a slow process. It can often be disheartening because we think it's not moving fast enough. And yet the transformation, as we've seen and witnessed over maybe hundreds of years, and as I feel accelerating really before our very eyes, we do have effect. And when we're disheartened as writers, we just need to kind of hold on to the sense that our words do matter and that they can have effect.
Thank you for that, May. Sonia?
I'm taking off on what May said, the connection between writers and readers. I think that is the crux of it. I think eventually it all boils down to that. That is the sacred connection. And I think whatever the medium might be, whatever the language might be, I think everything in itself, a sentence, a poem, or even an article, a political article, is a story at the end of the day. And I kind of am reminded a little bit of what Ishiguro said when he said that at the end of the day, stories are just about one person saying to another person, this is how it feels to me. Does it feel like this to you? That's pretty much what we're trying to do with all our writing. And if we can continue to do that, I think we can traverse that language barrier or scape.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Taryn, if you could share your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just close up by saying thank you to all the amazing points of view I've had the chance to listen to, and to all of you, Ananke Festival, for organizing this. It's really, I think, I can't overstate the importance of having diverse women's voices from across the world in one place. And as a journalist, I think at least 80% of my job is to listen, and I've really enjoyed listening to everyone share their perspectives today. So thank you very much for that.
I think Tarun just took my ending and wrapped up the session. So all I can say is thank you so much, ladies. I can't top that. This is really, really fantastic. And I hope that we can take this conversation forward and find more sort of constructive ways to sort of own not just various languages, but also use language to enable others to tell their stories by themselves, for themselves. Thank you.
Meher,
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
I really wanted one thing from you, which is
Yes.
to introduce yourself as well. Last but definitely not the least. So tell us a bit about yourself for the audience as
Oh
well.
my, oh sorry, okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm Meher Hussain.
No, tell us about the immense work that you've done.
I'm a journalist, author, publisher. My work has been more about using language to push for creative freedom. I feel that as females, we're conditioned how to think from the minute our gender is identified in the womb. How we use language, what we say, how we say it, to whom we say it, it's all conditioned. And when that realization comes in, and I feel that for many of us, it comes in too late, because by then we've compromised so much of ourselves, of our minds, bodies, hearts, souls, that when we do realize, and then when we do start to reclaim how we want to express ourselves in whatever format, whether it's in the creative way, a written way, spoken, audio, whatever it is, you do find yourself isolated. You do find yourself on a completely lonely path. And so that's what my work has always been about. And recently we came out with an anthology which featured contributions from people from all over the world, as a form of solidarity with Gaza, because I felt that it was very necessary for us to show that war is not the answer, as idealistic as it sounds, but ultimately it's not. And you've got to use language to fight the way forward. And we see the truth coming out now. For many of us who've been tweeting, for many of us who've been writing, for many of us who've been talking about it, it's not so much about validation, but it's about knowing that your words have value and the truth is coming out. And that's what we need to uphold. So that's it. That's from me.
Thank you for having us. This has been fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But it
I think it
goes
was
to
a very
Sabine.
interesting session.
Thank you all. An amazing session, amazing people. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much. The credit goes to each and every one of you, Meher, especially you, for helming the ship, and all our honored guests. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Take
Thanks.
care. And you can
Thank
see
you.
your video on YouTube. I've been checking. We were there live.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Next up, we have a tribute to Palestine, readings from Palestinian poets. Stay tuned.